Welcome to Specific Love. Here recently we've had a large influx of DIYers coming into the community, and I felt strongly that I needed to get back to the basics to help them out so they can get their projects done quicker and safer. So for this video, let's talk about the circular saw. Now when you're looking at circular saws, you have the choice between the corded version and the battery operated version, and both of these have their own benefits. The corded version is usually a little bit cheaper, and you can run it all day long as you have a power source, but you are limited to, of course, how far you can stretch out your extension cord. Now when it comes to the cordless version, I love it because I can literally take this out to the middle of the woods, take a bunch of extra batteries with me, and I don't have to worry about plugging it in or needing that extra power source. So it's your choice, you can choose whatever model you'd like. Now knowing the components of your saw are very important, so let me quickly touch on those. Now first off, this is the base or the plate or even called the shoe. It has many names. This right here is what the saw rides on when you're cutting the wood. Now this right here is the retractable guard. It's what moves out of the way when you're making the cut, but also it immediately goes back to protect you or whatever this blade could potentially touch. Now as a side note, don't ever fully remove this retractable guard. That right there is just an accident waiting to happen. Now somewhere on all your circular saws, you're gonna have a knob or a lever here that will allow you to change your depth of cut here. And just put it to whatever you need, and then you can lock it back in place. And your saw should have some kind of a depth gauge somewhere on it. In my case, it's a little bit hard to see here, but this will allow you to exactly get the depth you want for your blade. Now somewhere on your circular saw, you'll also have an angle gauge. This right here will allow you to change the angle of your plate so you can get those angle cuts when needed. Now if you ever need to replace the blade, some of them will require a wrench to go on the nut here, but some of them will actually have a built-in Allen wrench with its own little holder so you don't lose it. Now when you put the Allen wrench in place, you'll notice that the blade, it's just free spinning, it's not stopping. So somewhere on your saw, you're gonna have a little button to push down. In my case, it's right here. When you push that down, it's going to lock that saw into place, or that blade into place. That way you don't have to worry about it, just freewheeling. Now to get the blade off, you need to turn this nut here in the same direction that the blade turns. In my case, it's like so. So I just give it a little twist. Oh, and there we go. Now I can easily take that blade off, replace it, and just reverse the process. Now of course, when you're changing out the blade, make sure you take the battery out or unplug it. Safety first. Now with all the basics out of the way, here's a bunch of tips to make this saw work the best for you. Now the first thing you need to remember when you're dealing with the circular saw is that it is a dangerous tool, and there's a very good chance at some point while you're cutting you're going to have kickback. Kickback is literally where the blade catches on the wood and kicks back towards you. So you need to make sure your main hand here is on there very well. It's nice firm grip, and you're prepared with your arms, because that way if for some reason it does kick back, you're ready for it. Also, if you can have a second hand on here while you're cutting, that's even better, because that'll prevent any kind of major jarring if that is to happen. So be careful and have a firm grip. Now when you're cutting your wood, you need to be very careful about how it is supported underneath. If I was to cut this board right here, you'll notice that the support's on the outside. If I started to cut across the middle of this board, the board would then start to bind in the middle here, grabbing that blade and causing some major kickback. So if you were to cut a board, you need to make sure you have it fully supported all the way across. In my case, I'd probably do something similar to this and have this as a sacrificial board underneath. That way it's fully supported. I'd cut this board and just have a little bit of a groove in this and use this as just sacrificial cuts for later. Now if you're just going to cut off a small piece off the end of one of your boards, I'd prefer to actually hang it off of something. For example, your workbench or maybe even another piece of wood. Then just take your saw and cut it just like so. That'll allow gravity to pull it away from you, and you don't have to worry about it binding. Now when you're cutting plywood, I would strongly recommend to actually get some foam insulation from 1 to 2 inches thick, and you lay it on the ground first and then lay plywood on top of it. That will allow you to cut the plywood with just a small bit of your blade going into the foam insulation, and you don't have to worry about hitting anything underneath the wood, and it is fully supported. I've used this on a couple of big projects and it works great. Now whenever you're cutting plywood or anything for that matter that's really wide, it's a good idea to create some kind of a guide for your saw. In my case, this is just an old level. You don't have to use this. You can use anything straight. Even an old 2x4, as long as you know it is perfectly straight. Once you have it, then you want to clamp it in place here so you know it will not move, and then use it as the guide for your saw to make that nice straight cut. Now let's say you're making that straight cut and you realize, oh no, you're just a little bit off on that line. Do not try and twist your blade. That right there is a really good reason for it to kick back on you. Instead, back the saw up till you know where you're still straight on that line, and then continue that cut along the line. Now when you first get your saw, it's a good idea to take a measurement between your blade and the outside of your base on both sides. That'll allow you to know the exact additional area you need to add for your cuts. Now each of these will vary per make and model, so I would definitely measure out each one of these, and then somewhere, possibly on the front of your saw, you can write that number down so that it's easy to remember. Now if you're cutting just a narrow piece of wood, I'd probably suggest using a speed square to make this quick and straight. Take your speed square, line it up exactly where you need it to be, and you can use your hand to hold it down, or you can even clamp this down and then use it as the guide to make your straight cut. Now when you're going to make your cut, make sure you start your blade a little bit back from your wood. If you were to start it actually touching the wood, a few things could happen. One, you could be lucky and it could just bog down the motor. But two, it could easily kick back on you or just damage the wood in general. So whenever you're starting your cut, make sure you leave a little bit of room, start the blade, and then just ease into it. Now let's say you're only making a partial cut through the wood. In other words, you're going to stop midway through and then pull the blade out. In a case like that, you want to make sure the blade comes to a full stop before you pull the wood out. I'm guilty of it, and I'll tell you why you don't want to do that. It's because you can have two things easily happen. One, you can have kickback. Dangerous, of course. And at the very least, when you do that, it's going to gouge that wood as you pull it out, thus making that surface not as sharp as you would like. So just wait that extra few seconds, let that blade stop turning, and then pull it out. Now whenever you're about to cut your wood here, you want to make sure your blade does not stick way below. That could cause damage to anything underneath it. So we want to raise your blade to where it is only about 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch below your workpiece here. And that will just be a lot less damage to anything underneath it and less likely for you to hit anything in general. Just remember, that's a great safety habit to get into. Now when you get a circular saw, a lot of times it comes with a basic blade. This one happens to have 24 teeth on it. This will cut fast, but it's also a very rough cut. So this would be good for like framing or maybe some carpentry if it's going to be hidden. Now if you want something for like cabinetry or plywood, I'd suggest something like this blade, which has 60 teeth. This will allow it to have a nice finish when you have a cut, and you don't have to worry about going back and fixing up all of the jagged pieces that this one would probably cause. Now the next 3 tips are going to be great when you're cutting cross grain, especially on plywood. Whenever you cut cross grain, there's a very good chance that you're going to have some tear out where the fibers come up and it's just going to look ugly right where you cut. Well, here's a great way to stop that. Take a straight edge, put it exactly where you want to cut, get you a nice sharp knife, and you want to score that a couple times, and that'll break those fibers that are on the top. Then move your straight edge over and do your cut, and you should have a nice sharp edge. Now depending on your project, sometimes it doesn't matter if there's a little bit of tear out on one side. Let's say on a cabinet. You're going to have one side that's on the inside of the cabinet that's never going to be seen, and nobody's going to go and inspect that. You just want those outside fibers and outside pieces of wood to look pristine. In those cases, make sure that the side that'll be seen to be on the bottom of your cut. The reason why is the saw cuts in an upward fashion and everything on the bottom will be nice and sharp. Now here's one more way to help get a nice clean cut on both the top and the bottom. This will actually require 2 cuts. The first cut is only going to go about 1/4 to 1/3 of the way into the wood. And that will help sever all those top fibers and keep them nice and clean. Then you're going to make a second cut at the full depth, and that should help with everything on both sides. Now sometimes when you're making a cut, especially at an angle, you notice as I'm pushing this in, see the guard is moving and I'm not touching it. It's hitting the wood down here, and that could cause a bad angle to begin your cut, thus throwing off the rest of your cut. In these instances, you can come back here, lift up your guard a little bit, begin your cut. Once you get in about 1 inch or 2, then let the guard go back down and finish your cut. And that should allow you to have a nice start to your cut. Now sometimes when you need to make a cut in the center of a board, but you don't want to cut from the outside coming in, that's called a plunge cut. And I just want to let you know that is quite dangerous because there's a very good chance of kickback and just a lot of issues in the process. So don't take this cut lightly, alright? Let me show you how you do it. First off, make sure the blade is only slightly deeper than the wood that you're cutting into. Now we're going to pivot everything off the front of our plate here, so make sure you have everything lined up with the blade and exactly where you want to cut. Once you have it ready, then pull the guard back and be careful here because you want to next pull the trigger and have the blade starting to spin. Then be prepared because once you start moving this, there's a very good chance for kickback, and so you want to hold steady and hard and slowly, and I mean slowly, go into your wood making that cut. Now I can't say this enough, doing this is dangerous. There's a very good chance it's going to kick back on you, so be very, very careful. Now it is possible to rip a long board with a circular saw, but there are a couple things you need to keep in mind. Of course, the support. In my case here, I have a couple boards that are out on towards the ends because it's not going to be binding in the middle because I'm not doing a cross cut. As long as these boards are sacrificial and it doesn't matter if you cut into them, they're okay. Now the other thing is you need to make sure this is secured and not going to move around on you. I've had it several times. I've been in a rush trying to cut a board and it moved around and I didn't get the exact cut I was trying. So you can either clamp it down to something, or let's just say you have this on sawhorses, you could always take a small nail, make sure it's out of the way, and put a small nail through your wood so it goes into the sawhorse below and doesn't move around on you. That way you can do a nice long rip cut with your circular saw a little bit safer. Now most of these tips I've given you work with a corded and a battery operated circular saw. But here's one that's strictly for the corded. If you have one with a cord, you need to watch out two things. One, you need to know exactly where this cord is so you don't accidentally cut into it and get electrocuted, or at the very least just ruin your cable. And number two, you need to know where this is at so it doesn't get hung up on something. For example, the wood you're cutting, or maybe around the table leg, and just cause you to stop or get your saw where you're jerking it and thus causing a bad kickback or just some other kind of accident. So know where your cord is. Now let's say you're in the middle of a cut and your motor on your circular saw starts to bog down or just slow down. Doesn't seem like it's working right. Right at that point you need to stop. It could be a number of things. One, you could be cutting into something really hard like a knot. Two, your blade could be dull. Possibly even your battery might be going dead. Or you might just be cutting too much wood at one time. When this happens, you just need to make sure you know exactly what's going on and stop it, because one, it's bad on your saw, and two, it could easily cause an accident. So if you start to bog down, stop, figure it out. And last but definitely not least, always remember your eye protection and your ear protection, because you're going to sling a bunch of wood and it's going to be noisy doing it. And there you have a bunch of tips for using your circular saw. Now, if by chance you have any other ideas or tips to help out beginners, please list those in the comments. We want them to be able to make the cuts they want safer. With that said, I hope you can get out in your shop and have fun building. Now, the next 3 tips are going to be great for when you're cutting. Now, you don't want to have a piece. You don't have to come in from the outside. You don't want to cut from the outside. Now, when you're looking at. Oh, come on. Now, there's